Good morning, everybody. Welcome to everybody who I haven't had the opportunity to meet yet. Usually being quiet speaking isn't a problem for me, but as long as I get close to the mic, I guess I'll be okay. A little bit first about the context for what I'm up here. Gathering Waters is a service organization for land trusts in Wisconsin. And by service, I almost mean a little bit more from a support standpoint. And I should probably back up a little bit too. There are these organizations, a little over 40 of them in Wisconsin, that are private entities, nonprofits that are involved in conserving and stewarding land for the long term. And I'll talk a little bit about more how they do that and what their impact on the landscape is in a bit. But Gathering Water's sole task is to support those folks, help them build capacity, improve their effectiveness and efficiency. And something very important in Wisconsin is being an advocate, literally in the legislature, in support of something called the Knowles-Nelson Stewardship Program, which provides funding to help municipalities, as well as at least previously DNR and organizations like private land trusts, grants money to help conserve land. And just to give you a sense for the impact, I just pulled these data yesterday, and we're keeping pretty current these days. I should mention, by the way, one of the things that makes the thing possible, actually to kind of catalyze this whole project with Gathering Waters, is when I convinced them about 5-6 years ago to start building a layer of all of the holdings, as they're referred to in the land trust business, across the state. And at the time we first built this thing that we call a conservation database, there were about 1,500 holdings and about 40,000 acres. As of now, we're over 200,000 acres and approaching over 1,800 holdings. Holdings is a generic term, by the way, for fee simple. They actually purchase the land, in comparison to easements, usually are the two major characterizations of the kinds of holdings. There may be nuances about life estates and that sort of stuff, but basically they fall into two buckets. They either own the land or they have an easement on the land. And in either case, they have a perpetual responsibility to preserve, maintain, and in cases, restore and improve the quality of those lands. Or usually they don't have to restore them because they're looking for high quality lands to begin with, okay? It's interesting, by the way, you'll see the sort of disproportionate relationship between the number of holdings and the size of easements versus fee simple. It makes kind of sense if you think about it, because it costs way more to purchase high quality land than it is to get an easement on them, right? So purchases tend to be smaller, easements tend to be larger, just in terms of the kinds of opportunities they present to the trust. It's also very interesting for me, at least, and by the way, I'm a Gathering Waters board member. I've been on the board for 8 years, so I had a firsthand look from the inside at this as to what potentially might be useful from a GIS perspective. Gathering Waters didn't do any GIS when I started on the board 8 years ago, and it's really become quite a core piece of what we do today. I love this map because it really bears truth of, this isn't just we're a bunch of deep-pocketed people live and are willing to donate lands and that sort of stuff, right? These projects are all across the state. And it's pretty rewarding to see that there are projects in all but a couple or three counties, I think, in Wisconsin. So again, the two things that trusts do primarily is protect lands, conserve lands, and then steward them on an ongoing basis. And that's facilitated by state legislation that enables landowners to take tax credits for donating either an easement or their land. And then it is beholden on the trust to maintain those lands over time. And so, particularly with easements, they have to monitor those properties every year or two to make sure that there aren't, just sometimes it's simple mistakes. They mow beyond the edge of their property and all of a sudden they've taken out plants or shrubbery or trees, even in some cases, egregious cases. So they have to defend those boundaries, because if they don't, they can be declared in court to be sort of ignoring the value of those lands and the responsibilities, and those rights of those easements could actually be taken away over time. What I began to hear more and more when I engaged with trusts on an individual basis was they had this idea that they could do what they do more efficiently and more effectively by applying mapping and GIS to their workflows, right? And so we began to form this concept of providing a tool that end users could use, people that aren't familiar with GIS or have GIS skills, to be able to prioritize from amongst the whole body of parcels across the state. And thankfully, Howard's office does a wonderful job under the provision of the Wisconsin Land Information Program to create this statewide parcel map and come up with a new version of that every year, right? Without that, this whole idea wouldn't be practically possible. And then be able to use that data with a bunch of other data attached to it to be able to say, these are criteria we can use to filter these parcels down to a much shorter list of large, high quality parcels that we can then go directly to landowners and say, would you be willing to work with us in either the conservation or the protection of your properties? So what we ended up, looked like a pretty simple thing. There's only a couple of tools and widgets in this little web app builder app, right? But the power behind it is what's really interesting. And I'll hopefully try to characterize that in the next 5 or 10 minutes before I switch to a whole nother topic. So here's kind of what it looks like in close and personal, so to speak. Part of what we wanted to really try to do is make these as little bit wonky as we could, right? So I spent a lot of time trying to make these pop-ups with a lot of rich information from the statewide parcel map compact, but yet easily understandable to a non-technical audience. And one of those things that I did is we attached all of the 16 classes of the WISC DNR's land cover data. And I was able to figure out a way to sort of, using just HTML behind the scenes, create a little bar chart. So it was really quickly, and they didn't have to think about, okay, what does 53 acres means in terms of the size of the parcel and all that other sort of stuff, right? There's just a simple little bar graph. And that was just an example of the extent we went to try and make this really easy and straightforward for non-technical end users to be able to utilize. So again, part of this process is, and this is I spent many years in sales and marketing, there's this funnel sort of concept, right? We got all of these opportunities out there. How do we winnow them down to the ones that we really care about? So a lot of this web app builder app is a long dialog box with a bunch of different filters that they can apply on the fly and see the impact of applying those filters interactively as they're utilizing the app, right? So size, and then and this started largely, by the way, with one trust that works in this area called Landmark, that was interested in applying climate resilience aspects to some of their decision making. And Nature Conservancy provides a great resource of data across the country that presents 10 or 11 layers of information that get at this notion of climate resilience. And I should say climate resilience in that context isn't, we're going to see these hemlock hardwood forests forever. Climate change is happening. What resilience really means in this case is that the underlying sort of geophysical aspects of this and the ecological resources that are there are going to result in some sort of healthy ecotype being there, even if this hemlock hardwood forest transitions to sycamore forest at some point in time. I'm just making this up and making a real egregious situation, right? So we used the size of the parcel, the resilience, the local connectivity or connectedness, I think Nature Conservancy calls it. We since added recognized biodiversity, as well as in the latest release, which I'm just finishing up the data work on now, conservation opportunity areas from DNR and outstanding and exceptional resource waters and state natural areas. And there's 27 layers of information that are either numeric scores, if you will, or that are simply proximities to one of those existing areas. a lot of value can be had by finding conservation opportunities that are adjacent to other existing areas, right? So the conservation project for a land trust can be a buffer to an already existing state natural area, as an example. And just the more we can get these contiguous large areas with multiple blocks, the more impact that we can have and the more effective that we can be. So parcels kind of work their way through the funnel, and we call them targets. So we actually then will take individual parcels and aggregate them by tax bill address. We do that because the wife can own one and adjacent property is owned by the husband, and another property is owned by a trust between the two of them, right? It looks like three different people, but using the tax bill address, it's a convenient way to aggregate those parcels into bigger targets. And again, that's a really powerful sifting criteria, if you will. Okay, so the thing that was interesting from our perspective is as soon as we made the initial sort of beta version of this available and had trusts start taking a look at it, they said, well, this is really interesting for other stuff too. Because in addition to having the scores attached to the parcels, we also included in the app the ability to turn on and off literally dozens of context layers of not only the filtering criteria, but lots of other things, right? Soils and farmland and a bunch of other things. And trusts said immediately, we can use this for focusing our stewardship efforts, right? If I've got all this contextual information, I know what's going around this one property that we know may need work to take out invasive vegetative species as an example, but having all those information and air photos and so on and so forth available allow me to do a much better job of prioritizing where we're going to put our efforts and what kind of efforts we're going to apply. The other one that emerged pretty quickly, as well as they've got to put all this documentation together, not only internally with their staff and their boards to approve a project that they're going to try and get funding for, and have more than the simple little maps that they often were doing with Google Maps or whatever, because it was the easiest and the quickest thing that they had available. Now they've got a tool with a lot of really rich information. They can generate a lot of maps quickly that support the documentation for those sorts of projects. Okay. A lot of detail here on what we do with parcels, but we decided to use parcels that are 1 acre or larger. That gives us about 1.7 million parcels. There's a couple of other things we can get rid of, and stacked condominium parcels, that sort of stuff. So I filter all those out. There are a number of counties that will create big, jumbled, complex parcels that are all of the water, all of the right of way, all that other sort of stuff. So the best that I can, I filter that stuff out, and we end up left with about 1.6 million parcels. We do, though, keep stacked parcels where there are only two owners. There's a few counties in the state that, rather than just differentiating them based on this Department of Revenue land code, there's a name for it, and I can't remember what it is. At any rate, whether it's residential or commercial or industrial or forestry or ag or that sort of thing, they also, because we don't have digital data that represents the portion of a parcel that's taxed as residential versus the part that's taxed as forestry, as an example. They will put two overlaying parcels just to represent that there's some taxation for forestry, there's some taxation for residential. We keep those, but if there are 3 or more stacked parcels, we get rid of them. There then is, just from a data management and storage space standpoint, because we'll push all this stuff up into ArcGIS Online as well, we filter out a bunch of attributes that aren't useful for us for the purposes of this. And then, of course, we then add a bunch of stuff back for all these other criteria that get added and scores that are attached to the parcels. And then the parcels, the Gathering Waters trust holdings, and there's a layer of very specific to the Southeast Wisconsin counties that are serviced by the Southeast Wisconsin Regional Planning Commission, where they have this layer of environmental corridors. And people were interested in the ability to be able not only filter parcels, but be able to filter those out too. So if they work with a couple of other trusts in the area, they can just view those parcels and not have a bunch of other stuff in the map that they don't care about. So this is kind of what the filtering criteria was at the version that we presented at our conference back in May. We've since added a whole bunch more that I can talk a little bit more about, but in the interest of time, I should probably go here. These are these characteristics that relate to this Department of Revenue assessment classes, if you will. This could be a whole seminar topic for a semester if you wanted to, but we'll not go there. This is just a representation of the kinds of layers that we've got that people can turn on and turn off. And you learn little tricks, as an example, about depending on what service area, what the size of the parcels are for an individual trust. They may want some of these layers on at larger scales or smaller scales. So teaching people how to use these sort of standard pop-up tools that come up when you're using ArcGIS Online Web App or ArcGIS Pro or this app. And that gets a little bit wonky, right? But being able to set at which scales the data are going to be visible can be really important in their ability to be able to get informed about what's going on with a particular situation. So in terms of navigating the app, just to give you a little idea again, there's a big, long about box here to orient them to what the tool is supposed to do, how it is that they go about it, and all of the data sources. I just remembered for the new version of the app, I got a lot of work to update that about box. Again, a simple set of tools, and those two in the middle that says filter features and parcels and select features from any layer are the ones where 90% of this magic sauce occurs, right? The select features from any layer, and essentially the filtering tools are doing selections, right? And you'll see what you see on the map get reduced to only those features that pass the criteria that you've set at that point. And then if you want to take a subset of those for a specific project, then you can apply that sort of second level of selection tools, and they will get highlighted in a yellow or other color as the app has. So you can differentiate the selection from the filters for the selection for a subset of selection on top of that. And then you can use, there's a little attribute box that'll pop, or table that'll pop up on the bottom just by clicking a little tab that'll allow people to do sorts and sequence and statistics and so on and so forth, or just export the table to an Excel file that they can then do mail merge. And that was one of the first things that Landmark wanted to do. They took, I think, about 3,000 and they did a mass mailing, and they got some hits right off the bat. We just heard from North Central Conservancy Trust. They did a very similar exercise. They went through and they got 300 properties, sent out mail, and they immediately got some hitbacks on that too. So some really good case stories about what the value is for using this. I created some search layers in the web map supporting this, so they can look search for even just orienting a map, state natural area name, or the name of a gathering waters member trust holding, that sort of thing, just for quick ways to navigate around the map. They were pretty interested in the swipe tool. That can be handy for looking at, the Esri world imagery versus DNR's statewide aggregation of all the leaf-off photography. Those are pretty valuable to understand what's going on in context, as well as being able to add layers from other contexts. If you want to add a map service from someplace else or a local shapefile or those sorts of things, you can do those. Those don't stick. There's no way to sort of save the context of the project, but at least allows people to add those other contextual layers to their view. This is kind of what I was referring to earlier in terms of setting some of these characteristics that make visibility and viewing of specific layers for specific purposes easy. Okay, this is an example of what that filter pop-up dialog box looks like. It's long, and the next version is going to be much longer than that because we're literally going to have 27 separate criteria that people can apply. So it's going to be a little unwieldy in that way, but people are just chomping at the bit to be able to get access to all these other criteria that they can apply. And again, they don't need a subscription. Gathering Waters actually supplies the ArcGIS Online named user that the individual land trusts can use. So they don't need anything. They don't need anybody with GIS information. We do the maintenance of the conservation database, so all of their holdings are in there. They love it. Here's some of the filter prompts. I think guys have seen these before, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about that. This was kind of a breakthrough just mentally for me, is not to just use these assessment categories, if you will, for filtering out parcels, but also to filter in parcels. So Nate, I used to do tons of work to say, okay, well, we use these to filter out parcels. In some cases, they want some of those properties. Somebody wants agricultural properties. Somebody's not interested in agricultural properties, right? So we just made it way easier. We said, okay, you can either select which categories are going to be in or which categories are going to be out, or some combination thereof. In some cases, they may want it to explicitly declare some being in, some being out. So this was really quite a breakthrough and people love it. Okay, more of that. The filter widget. There also is one other tool in there that's called a Smart Editor tool. The next step after you figured out what the targets are is you want to track what your efforts are in terms of reaching out to these people are, right? So I created a bunch of fields in here that are like a simple sales contact management capability, right? Who did the staff person did you assign it to? When? What was the initial activity that you did towards them, and what's the result of it, and what the current status of with the outreach with that landowner. So just real simple and basic, but there's a little tool on there that they can edit this data for a particular target or parcel that they click on. And by the way, we're going to keep parcels and targets because for the larger trusts that are looking for really big properties, this targets thing is really powerful. For a lot of smaller land trusts, especially in Southeast Wisconsin, where they often are working with small parcels because those are the opportunities that are available, they really are more interested in working on individual parcels. So we'll keep both of those in the final dashboard. Here's the select widget that I was talking about a few minutes ago, and what the graphic representation of that sort of sub-select looks like on the map. The tables, I chatted about that briefly. More stuff, here's the specific stuff about adding data from either a local file or another service someplace. This was kind of a revealing revelation to me. A former colleague of mine used to call it Department of Redundancy Department. That for those of you that may not be familiar with this, I suspect many of you in this meeting are, but there isn't almost a day goes by that I'm not astounded by the level of easily accessible service data that are available from Wisconsin DNR. I got to the point one day where so many people were asking about how it is that we find this stuff and so on and so forth. I literally sat down and just started building a web map. This web map has over 700 individual layers that DNR supplies. And don't be confused that this habitat management layer, these are all individual layers within that one. So this is a public, if you search for WIDNR GIS services, this is a public facing web map. You can go start exploring. And a lot of these are individual map service that there's map services within map services. There's sub layers with even some of those. So the richness and the detail of the data. Now, surely you get into invasive species as an example, and there's layers and layers and layers for every species. So a lot of the repetitive content type, but they're all individually rich, and I highly encourage you to explore. Here's just an example of one item in that web map and the level of detail that it blows out to if you actually then open up that layer into its sublayers. To get to Carrie's point, I almost didn't think that to show this. This is the process I used Model Builder for a very similar reason. I love the fact that it's self-documenting, but we're not passing the use of this part of the tool because this is all back office stuff that we're taking responsibility for at Gathering Waters. At some point, I'll pass this on to somebody else that will do this like once a year when Howard's office does the latest update to the statewide parcel database and run through this whole process again to do all these calculations and put the parcels together and weed out all the condo parcels and yada, 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 and do all these proximity tests, right? I literally have this down to 5 model builder models. Sorry, my thumb isn't working right these days. And one script. The only reason I did the script is because to create a model with 27 proximity tests is a really painful, burdensome process. But once I had one of those scripts done, all I had to do was sort of change the layer source and within half an hour, I was done. So one script, 5 miles. Okay. I'm in the interest of time because I'm almost over ready. I'm going to go through this story really quickly. I'm involved on a volunteer basis with there's a core group of 6 or 8 people that are trying to create essentially what is a scenic byway that goes from La Pointe over on Madeline Island through this ecological landscape that's called the Northwest Sands down to St. Croix Falls. The whole state of Wisconsin was broken up by Wisconsin DNR many years ago into these ecological landscapes. It's very interesting stuff. So several of these red blotchy areas, which are DNR, actually take it back, Muckwa Barrens and the Shawangunk-Nicolet National Forest is national forest property, but those are all barrens areas. In fact, this whole region, just by the name, is sandy soils largely, right? A lot of jack pine, relatively dry, but it's a really neat landscape. And the reason it's important historically and culturally is it was a travel route for indigenous folks a long time ago, for centuries, but also then foot travel. Oh no. It's okay. I'm not going to be here long anyway. Usually when that comes up, I still have time left. I'm just going to ignore. Well, can we make that go away? Yeah, oh, that's yours. Yeah, that's not mine. We do need to get that one plugged in.
We lost your audio. I don't know if you can hear us.
All right. Awesome. Are people on the meeting hearing me at this point?
Yep.
Perfect. And they must be seeing it because, okay. All right. This is a DNR document. By the way, there's a web link on this page that talks about the master plan for the Northwest Sands area. How we started with this is by going through a lot of historical maps, right? And trying to figure out where this historical trail was. It turns out there's a lot of really good documentation on this, but it's scattered and cartography isn't all real good or consistent or that sort of stuff. We also went and literally looked at historic documents. This was a popular periodical back in the day, and they talked about this journey that they took and how many days it took to get them from St. Paul up to La Pointe. I mean, some of the stories that they talk about and wildlife that they took to feed themselves while they're traveling in these, these wayside stops. Fascinating stuff. Then we start with stuff like this. Well, what are you going to do with that, right? And it's inconsistent in availability. There's a place in Ely, Minnesota called Trygg, Trygg, that made these maps a number of years ago. They're still in business and they sell maps generally, people that are going to go up the boundary waters, that sort of stuff.
I made a mistake there. Can you just share your screen again?
Oh,
Okay. Yeah, I was.
sorry.
Just go to Teams and.
Should be good. Rid of this. And too many things open here. There we go. It does maximize
I'm
that.
sharing my screen. It's odd. Share your presentation. Or Teams. Go to your Teams window.
Well, I don't have a Teams window because I don't have the app loaded.
And well, we'll stop sharing and then hit share again.
I think it was working, Scott, the way it was supposed to be.
It was working?
Yeah.
Oh, because this is my screen here.
Well, that's the way it works.
Okay,
Yeah, right.
all this complications.
Okay. Okay, so what I ended up then is starting to overlay various of these historical maps that we had. So we could begin to actually sketch in and georeference them in ArcGIS Pro. So here's an example of 3 of those trig maps with the Northwest Sands underneath. You can sort of see it bleeding through so that we can start sketching in where that historical trail was. And that gave us a framework, a skeleton, if you will, to say, here's where stops along that trail that had historical ecological importance would be interesting to have and be able to capture them. So here's some other historical, here's one example of an old historic map and 2 other relatively newer ones that you can see they're kind of in the same place, and I georeference them to the best of my ability. We brought in some other sources of information for where there weren't services readily available. That was for the Muckwa Bears management area in the Chequamegon. There were times we just took, regular pictures to just give us orientation points of, here's the lake that flows into St. Croix River as an example, but it was supposed to be taken from a place where there's a memorial to an Indian chief back in the day, and it helped us figure out exactly where it was and where it was taken and that sort of thing. We used newer sources of data as well. In this particular one, the German Hermann, however they pronounce that fire, big area, but we were trying to find out where would be an appropriate area to have a stopping point that would be useful for reference. And it turned out we did it way in the southwest corner here. We even used very recent LiDAR. We actually did a field reconnaissance trip on this one, and there are places where you can still see the remains of the rock or block foundations for some of these buildings. This was a sort of trading post, and there was a little bridge there. You can see some of the bridge abutments are still there. We even found in the St. Croix one day, actually that was the same day, a log with markings where they would sort of do a stamp with a hatchet of what the sort of logo was for a timber company. This is just an example of the ArcGIS web map where you can begin to get a sense for what this could look like as you click on individual sites in the multimedia that's available for a particular stop. And again, we used the web map to sketch in areas where we wanted to change the automated generated tour that ArcGIS Online gave us, but do one that makes more sense from the standpoint of somebody who's actually driving along that trail. It turns out that most of these wildlife areas also have their own identified tours. So we're going to incorporate those eventually as sort of sub tours or side tours that people can do while they're exploring places along the literally exactly 50 stops, as it turns about, at least today, along the route. And then, oh, by the way, there is some that actually goes across Wisconsin. As you can imagine, there isn't just one path, right? There's a path that goes from Ashland. There's one that goes from Little Sea Creek. There's actually 2 to north and south of Bayfield. So there's a bunch of them. We're trying to fix sort of what the sweet spot is for some of them that might have been traveled most often. And then there's this one that sort of goes over towards Minnesota through a little community there called Sunrise. This is an example of where we are today. The dash line is what we think is the best representations of used historical trails. And there are in some of the Barrens areas, by the way, if you know what you're looking for and where you're looking, there are places where you can see two tracks from covered, wagons and that sort of stuff. It's pretty amazing to be out there in the middle of one of those Barrens areas and all of a sudden realize you got a set of tracks that you're standing right in the middle of. It's really interesting. And then that's just a sort of a finished map that we've been sharing with community groups and others that are interested in trying to help make this thing a reality. So we can talk more about lunch if you got other questions, but